So today we'll be talking about Chapter 13, Section 2, talking about settling on the Great Plains. What was life like for these individuals who moved out to the Great Plains? What were some hardships they experienced? And how did the land change as a result of these rapid population growths? So as we talk about settlement, one of the biggest changes that I forgot to mention was the railroads. The major technological improvement that is going to improve folks' ability to get out to these places. I mean, yes, settlers were moving as far as Oregon long before the railroad, but these journeys were perilous. People died along the way. I'm sure you've heard of the Donner Party. Many people didn't make it. And many more were discouraged from even trying. Many more were discouraged from even trying to make the journey because it was so perilous, it was so difficult. But railroads are going to make this possible. It's going to make it easy. You buy a ticket, in a few days, you are safely and comfortably in a new place. And in the 1860s, the major infrastructure project going on in our country was the building of railroads, in particular transcontinental railroads. By the 1880s, there were 5 of these, 5 railroad tracks stretching across the entire country, connecting the east and the west coast. This is going to attract people to be able to move. For the first time, you can buy a ticket and you can ride a train anywhere you want to go in the country. That is generally. I mean, you still have to migrate somewhat, but towns and cities are going to grow along these railroads. Railroads are now the new real estate developers selling land to farmers, and are going to attract many people to come into the area because, number one, transportation requires a large labor force. And so immigrants are going to come in, particularly from China, but from all over the world to work on these things. Now also in 1862, a law was passed, a very important law called the Homestead Act. Any person may receive 160 free acres of land. Any person who so desired may receive 160 acres of free land. There were a few qualifications. You had to be the head of a household, generally a male, and you had to be willing to live on this land. You didn't just to get a piece of paper saying you have land in Nebraska. No, you have to go move to Nebraska to receive this land. But during the heyday of the Homestead Act, up through about 1900, 600,000 families took advantage of this opportunity, receiving free land, and this helped to develop the West. Many of these people were exodusters. That is, African Americans leaving the Southeast for a number of reasons and moved to places like Kansas or Nebraska or various other territories that were rapidly growing in population. Now, there was a share of corruption. I mean, railroads were profiting from this, taking advantage of these people. Plenty of folks were speculating, that is, hiring someone to go and live on this land, to wait it out until that land became more valuable. In reality, of the Great Plains, where the Homestead Act applied, only about 10% of this land actually went to families. The rest was gobbled up by speculators who profited from this, or from railroads who were selling this, again, for a profit. But the bottom line is around 600,000 people qualified and were able to start new lives thanks to the Homestead Act. By 1872, everywhere in the lower 48 had been seen by someone. There were no more frontiers. There was no more unexplored territory. Yellowstone National Park was the first of its kind, the first national park created to protect wilderness areas. But yet by 1890, again, all lands had been explored by someone. But yet the frontier has remained an important part of American culture. We are a people of explorers. We are a people of adventurers. So, you've hit the jackpot. You and your family have qualified for the Homestead Act, and you have now received your 160 acres of free land on the Kansas prairies. Congratulations. You really got to go out there and see it sometime. And aside from the handful of towns that you pass through and the couple of large cities, it's pretty empty. It's pretty flat. And you often go hours, or if you were walking or riding horse, days without seeing so much as a tree. So congratulations, your piece of land has no trees. There's a railroad, but if you want to buy lumber, you're talking about a very expensive price tag on that lumber. You're probably not going to be able to afford it. So a lot of first-generation homesteaders would build their homes from what they had on the land. And the most abundant building material on the land was sod. No one had lived or developed permanent dwellings in much of the Kansas territory ever. And so eons of grass rotting on top of grass rotting had developed a very thick sod, a layer that can be cut into bricks, and you can build things out of it. And that's exactly what they did. And so many people wound up living in sod homes until they could afford to buy the lumber they needed for their homes. Many of these homesteaders were virtually alone. I mean, this is like Little House on the Prairie lifestyle, where people are living in very traditional roles. Families were having to work together to survive, men and women cooperating together. In fact, Western states often tend to be more progressive than do Eastern states because they have developed this culture of cooperation out of necessity. In fact, it was the Western states that, for example, first allowed women to vote. It was the Western states where many men and women were working equally side by side. But communities did develop as towns grew. But this part of our country is still a very wide open and empty part of our country because it is sparsely populated. Today we'll be finishing up our discussion of chapter 13 with section 3, and it's called Farmers and the Populist Movement. And we're going to be talking today about how farmers united to address common economic problems. And this gave rise to a new political party called the Populist Party.
In the summer of 1963, a high school teacher changed the way the world looked at the Wizard of Oz. His name was Henry Littlefield, and he was teaching an American history class. He'd made it to the late 19th century, a time called the Gilded Age. But he was struggling to keep his class interested in the complex social and economic issues of the time. Then one night, while he was reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz to his daughters, he had an idea. In the 1890s, farmers wanted to add silver to the gold standard to put more money in circulation and make it easier for farmers to borrow. In the book, Dorothy walked to the Emerald City on the yellow brick road in her silver shoes. The movie's ruby red slippers started out as silver. Silver and Gold on the Road to Prosperity. L. Frank Baum had published the book in 1900 at the height of the Gilded Age, and the analogy didn't seem out of the question. No one else had seen these connections, but that didn't deter Littlefield. He taught his class about the Gilded Age using the book, and soon he and his students were finding more connections. For instance, in the late 1890s, the U.S. had recently recovered from the Civil War, and integrated vast new territories, bringing an era of prosperity for some. But while industry and finance in the North and East prospered, farmers across the South and Midwest struggled. This led to the Populist movement, uniting farmers and workers against urban elites. By 1896, the movement had grown into the People's Party, and its support of Democrat William Jennings Bryan put him in reach of the presidency. Meanwhile, in Oz, claimed Littlefield, Dorothy is a typical American girl whose hard life in Kansas is literally turned upside down by powerful forces outside her control. The Munchkins are the common people oppressed by the Witch of the East, banks and monopolies. The Scarecrow is the farmer, considered naive, but actually quite resourceful. The Tin Woodman is the industrial worker, dehumanized by factory labor. And the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, who could be an influential figure if only he were brave enough to adopt the Populists' radical program. Together, they travel along a golden yellow road towards a grand city whose ruler's power turns out to be built on illusions. Littlefield published some of these observations in an essay. His claim that this fantasy was actually a subversive critique of American capitalism appealed to many people in the 1960s. Other scholars took up the theme, and the proposed analogies and connections multiplied. They suggested that Dorothy's dog Toto represented the teetotalers of the Prohibition Party. Oz was clearly the abbreviation for ounces, an important unit in the silver debate. The list goes on. By the 1980s, this understanding of the book was accepted so widely that several American history textbooks mentioned it in discussions of late 19th century politics. But is the theory right? L. Frank Baum's introduction claims the book is just an innocent children's story. Could he have been deliberately throwing people off the trail? And is it fair to second-guess him so many decades later? There's no definitive answer, which is part of why authorial intent is a complex, tangled, fun question to unravel. And some recent scholars have interpreted The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in the opposite way as Littlefield. They claim it's a celebration of the new urban consumer culture. Historian William Leach argued that the dazzling Emerald City of Oz was meant to acclimate people to the shiny new America. In the end, all we know for sure is that Baum, inspired by European folk legends, had set out to create one for American children. And whether or not he intended any hidden meanings, its continuing relevance suggests he succeeded in creating a fairy tale America can call its own.
So, there were many common problems that faced farmers all throughout the country. For example, most farmers nationwide had a large degree of debt for several reasons. Number one, to increase revenue, you needed more land, you needed more tools, you needed more workers. And farmers found themselves in a vulnerable position. For example, after the Civil War, the government during the war had stimulated the economy by boosting the supply of money through the creation of a currency called greenbacks. That is, a type of paper currency that had no gold or precious metals to back it up. Well, after the war, the government took those out of circulation. And what that means is that farmers who owed money, which are most farmers, really most poor people have some degree of debt, myself included, we found ourselves having to pay more money than what we actually owed, because the money that we had borrowed was worth less than the current value of money. So that's called deflation. That means the value of currency goes up. That helps you if you have money, that hurts you if you owe money. Second problem that faced all farmers. the price of crops fell dramatically. That is because the supply of crops rose dramatically. I mean, there's going to be an economic windfall from 600,000 new farms being established. That's a huge boost in the supply of agricultural products. So in the 1870s, farmers began to unite, began to lobby the government to push more money back into circulation. And this did result in the passage of the Bland-Allison Act. It was a small increase in the supply of money, but it really wasn't enough. Another common problem that farmers faced were the railroads. The railroads in Frank Baum's story are often represented by one of the wicked witches. And there's a reason for this. You see, in the 1880s, there were only 5 transcontinental railroads, 5 companies in the country. And I'd be willing to bet that many of these railroads were owned by the same companies. That means only a handful of companies in the entire country were transporting goods for farmers out west. That means options were limited. Competition was non-existent. And so railroads could charge whatever they wanted for shipping. Yeah, I mean, railroads would commonly take advantage of farmers. Why? Because they were a captive market. They had to buy from the railroads. And so the railroads could charge them whatever they wanted. It's very similar to the EpiPen controversy that you guys have heard about, I'm sure. Right now, EpiPens are sold by one manufacturer. The maker of EpiPens, a life-saving medicine for someone who has a severe allergic reaction, those EpiPens just went up dramatically in price. But you got to have it It's life or death if you don't and you have a severe allergy. You will die without that medicine. And so people have to pay that price. They have no choice. Farmers are in the same situation. They have to sell their crops. It's how they make a living. It's how they survive. No matter what the railroads charge them for shipping, the farmers have to pay it. Also, as we talked about, farmers were having to borrow money to buy supplies, and suppliers of these goods were charging extremely high interest rates. It became very difficult to make a living as a farmer. And so farmers organized. In 1867, Oliver Hudson Kelley started the Patrons of Husbandry, popularly known as the Grange. The purpose of this was to be a social organization, a union to educate farmers about problems they were facing, to educate farmers about the common problems they were facing, like the quote you saw, that regardless of race, if you're in farming, you're being taken advantage of. And that the railroads were using the issue of race to make people fight amongst themselves so that they wouldn't think about the real problem. Divide and conquer. So the Grange began forming farmers' alliances. These were groups of farmers and people sympathetic to their cause. They traveled the country and began to try to educate people about one of the real problems facing our country, that the poor are being taken advantage of. They gained 4 million members in the 1890s. In fact, they had enough people to create a political party. The slogan of the United Farm Workers was "United we stand, divided we fall." That the combined forces of united labor will prove invincible in their onslaught. That if the people can come together, we can accomplish a great deal. This movement is known as populism. Populism is defined as a movement of the people, of the common person. And they made as their platform several reforms. For example, in regards to the economy, one of the number one goals was to increase the money supply through the introduction of a bimetal currency, a currency backed not only by gold but also by silver. And that's why Dorothy's shoes allegedly were silver before the movie. Also, a graduated income tax. I don't know if you've heard, if you follow politics closely, maybe you've heard that one party favors a flat income tax, that everyone pays 10% of their income. And maybe that sounds fair in theory. But did you know that 10% of your income hits you a lot more dearly than 10% of a wealthy person's income? That you spend a higher portion of your income on non-discretionary items, like groceries. So 10% hits you a lot harder than 10% would hit a wealthy person. The graduated income tax is now known as the law of the land, but it was once a theory called radical and revolutionary because the populists brought it up. And then finally, federal loans for farmers. Federal loans for poor people. I have my house today because of a federal loan that once was considered radical by the populist. I'd still be renting were that not the case. In regards to politics, did you know that the U.S. Senate was once not elected by the people? They were appointed from amongst themselves. It's from an old tradition when Britain created the Parliament. The Senate was once called the House of Lords. They represented the nobility, not the common people. Now we elect our senators through the 17th Amendment. That was once considered radical. The secret ballot, when it was proposed. Now we take for granted that you do not have to disclose who you voted for. It is your right to tell people or not to. Again, once considered radical. Lastly, in regards to politics, the 8-hour workday. Yes, did you know that when you get to clock out at 5 o'clock or after 8 hours, whatever your shift is, thank a populist? Okay, now, in 1892, populist candidates had embedded themselves at different levels of government. Now, the Populist Party, as you'll see, eventually declined, but eventually the Democratic Party adopted this platform, championed this platform, and has been working for it ever since.
The roots of the Progressive Era reforms began many years earlier. For over 80 years, presidents and federal politicians had rewarded their supporters with lucrative government jobs. It was called patronage, or the spoils system, from an old war slogan. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American public grew increasingly disgusted with government corruption and favoritism. Some members of the Republican Party began a reform movement. Nicknamed mugwumps, they were influential Republicans who refused to support their party's presidential candidate, who they believed opposed reform. With the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, whom he had refused to hire for a government position, the outcry for an end to patronage reached a crescendo. Now President Charles A. Arthur convinced Congress to pass the Pendleton Act, establishing a federal civil service. Federal workers would now be hired based on competitive exams rather than political influence. Slowly, civil service regulations were expanded to almost all government jobs. The mugwump concept of an honest government based on merit laid the groundwork for progressive reform, as did two other political groups, the Populists and the Socialists. After the Civil War, many Americans returned to or began farming. But over the next decades, there was an overproduction of farm goods. With more supply than demand, prices plummeted lower and lower. At the same time, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and railroad transportation increased, leaving more and more farmers little money to support their families and still pay their debts to bankers. In protest, farmers began to organize political parties. Of them, the Populist Party emerged as the most powerful. The Populists supported an income tax based on earnings to support the government, rather than the tariffs then charged to farmers and businesses. They demanded a shorter workday government loans to farmers, the direct election of state senators, secret ballot voting, and other election reforms. But Republican William McKinley defeated the populist-supported presidential candidate, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, in 1896, and the Populist Party, if not its causes, faded.
Now, in the Panic of 1893, back to monopolies. Because of poor business practices, such as expanding faster than their actual ability to do so, many railroads began to go bankrupt. I don't know if you followed the recession. You guys were very young when it started in 2008. But there was a problem. Many of the large banks like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, some of the largest banks in our country, almost collapsed. And there was a discussion about what we should do. Because the problem was these banks were too big to fail. If they collapsed, our currency system would go with it. Our country could have entered a more severe Great Depression than what we went through in the 1930s. If these handful of companies had gone bankrupt. Why did they go bankrupt? It's complicated. There's a great movie about it called The Big Short, if you really want to understand why they went bankrupt. But the problem is, we had to bail out these banks because if we didn't, the alternative was financial collapse. And that happened in 1893 as well. When these railroads were on the verge of collapse and some did go bankrupt, there was a depression. There was a financial collapse. And really, looking back to 1893 is why we elected to bail out these banks in 2008. Now, what we also need to understand is that there are political divisions in our country. There was then, there are now, and these political divisions are often regional, and it's been that way forever. In the Northeast, the Republican base was made generally of Northeastern business owners, the wealthy, who owned a great deal of power and influence, and bankers as well. The Democratic Party generally represented the southern region of our country, as we talked about in Reconstruction, but also came to represent farmers in the West and the common person. And so the Populists merged and joined forces with the Democratic Party over these economic issues. And one of their chief concerns was bimetallism. And that is a financial system that would use not only gold to back it, but also silver. This would allow for an increase in the money supply. That is what we call a stimulus. Meanwhile, the gold bugs, as they called themselves, the Republican Party wanted only currency to be only backed by gold. And in fact, if you're a libertarian, you probably believe in the gold standard still. That is still something that many people favor. The idea with both theories was that paper money is worthless if it can't be exchanged for its value in precious metals. But again, bimetallism would stimulate the economy, according to their theory. Now, William Jennings Bryan, represented in the story by the Cowardly Lion, ran for president in 1896. He was the Democratic candidate, endorsed by the Populist Party. He personified this idea of championing the cause of the poor. He delivered a famous speech called the Cross of Gold speech, where he said that mankind is being crucified on a cross of gold. That the gold standard favors the wealthy, hurts the poor, and those in power are using divisiveness to distract you from what they are trying to accomplish. The wool is over your eyes. And the election became this idea of the poor versus the wealthy. William McKinley was the Republican nominee for president versus William Jennings Bryan. And the two began a national debate on economic issues. What Bryan was trying to, and what the Democratic Party really became after this point, was a party of economic reform. In fact, candidate after candidate, from Bryan all the way to Truman, decided to step away from social issues to focus instead on economic issues. And so here's a political cartoon. I mean, people made fun of him all day long for this. You know, he was the Bernie Sanders of his time, if you will. You know, they called him communist, socialist, old crazy lunatic. Why? Because he suggested such radical things as an 8-hour workday, such radical things as a graduated income tax, such communist ideas as the direct election of senators. Again, he was seen as a radical, and he was portrayed as a loony. While the election represented some very interesting discussions on real economic issues that affected us all, the election itself played out like most elections of this time. The Republicans cleaned up the Northeast. The Midwest went for Bryan, as well as the South, as well as farmers. But here's the thing, the northeastern states have such a higher population than do the Southerners and do these western states, that even in the Electoral College, McKinley won. He realized he didn't need those states, that he needed the support of these wealthy business owners who could guarantee the support of their workers. And we'll talk about how corrupt that is and how twisted that is later. Even though McKinley won, even though he didn't need the poor to win this election represents several neat things. Number one, that the poor can organize and can show real power without having to use a guillotine and kill all the rich people. They don't have to have a French Revolution. We can have a peaceful revolution of the people. But also, their ideas are now taken for granted as something that you and I expect, that we believe we deserve. People died so that you can have the right to vote for your senator. People died so that you can have an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, a safe place to work. It's part of the labor movement that we'll be talking about soon.
shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," said the Bible-quoting speaker William Jennings Bryan. The famous speech was ridiculed by some, but among the farmers whose lives were made difficult by the government's tight money policies, Bryan was a hero. He was the self-appointed spokesperson for common people. Their support won him the Democratic nomination for president in 1900. He ran against incumbent President William McKinley. Bryan was determined to carry forward the ideals of the Populist Party, founded by activists for farmers and laborers in Nebraska. He backed the Free Silver movement and the use of the secret ballot in elections. Although Bryan campaigned and spoke enthusiastically, he lost. Still, neither his energy nor his voice gave out through this and 2 more unsuccessful presidential election campaigns. Finally, Bryan supported Woodrow Wilson, who offered him the post of Secretary of State. When he lost the position for his pacifist views, it seemed his career was over. Then, in 1925, Bryan was brought back into the public eye. He volunteered to be on the prosecution team to argue against Clarence Darrow over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. This was the famous monkey trial, in which biology teacher John Scopes was brought to court for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution to his class. In a surprise move, Darrow called Bryan to the witness stand as a biblical scholar to refute Darwin's assumptions and defend the idea that man is not descended from a lower species. Using the questioning tactics for which he was famous, agnostic Darrow hammered away at Bryan's fundamentalist beliefs. There was more at stake here than the fate of a small-town teacher. Darrow believed himself to be fighting for the future of science and education. When he finally trapped Bryan in his own inconsistency, Darrow had won the day. Even though John Scopes was convicted and fined $100, the confrontation was widely considered a crushing intellectual defeat for Bryan, who was made to look like a champion of backcountry ignorance. Even Bryan's partial triumph in winning the case was soon taken from him. The Scopes conviction was overturned on a technicality by the Tennessee Supreme Court. The renowned statesman and public speaker had given his all to this humiliating public appearance. 5 days after the trial, William Jennings Bryan was dead.